They say a mother's love is a force of nature, an unconditional tide that can weather any storm. But they never tell you what happens when another so-called mother decides to make you the storm her son needs weathering. They never tell you that the person who should be your greatest ally can become your most intimate enemy, waging a war not with weapons and shouts, but with whispers and smiles that cut deeper than any blade. My war was fought over the souls of my children. And my victory wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the slow, creeping, and utterly silent dawn that followed a very, very long night. This is a story about how I took back my family, not by fighting fire with fire, but by becoming the one thing my enemy couldn't possibly comprehend: a safe harbor. If you've ever felt undermined, disrespected, or pushed to the edge by someone who was supposed to be family, then you know the unique kind of helplessness I'm talking about. Stick with me, and I'll tell you how I turned that helplessness into surgical precision. And if my story resonates with you, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that stories of quiet strength deserve to be heard. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Back to the day I met the woman who would try to burn my world to the ground. Marrying Michael felt like coming home. He was the calm to my chaos, a steady hand in a world that often felt unsteady. Our courtship was a whirlwind of handwritten letters, long walks through autumn leaves, and the easy, comfortable silence that only old souls can share. He was an architect, a man who built things to last, and I believed our love was his finest creation. I was a freelance graphic designer, working from home, a life that promised the flexibility to build our family. We were a blueprint for happiness. But every structure has a weakness, a single point of failure. Ours was his mother, Margaret. I first met her over a Sunday roast at the house Michael grew up in. The house itself was a shrine to her taste, immaculate, cold, and opulent. Antique furniture stood like museum pieces you weren't meant to touch, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and lemon polish. It was the kind of clean that feels aggressive, a statement of control. Margaret herself was cut from the same expensive cloth. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, a string of pearls at her throat that seemed to tighten whenever she looked at me, and a smile that was a masterpiece of facial engineering. It engaged all the right muscles but carried zero warmth. It was a smile that assessed and dismissed you in the same instant. "Sarah," she said, her voice smooth as polished marble. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly firm, her rings cold against my skin. "Michael has told me so much about you." The pause was infinitesimal, but it was there. A little pocket of air where the word good was supposed to be, and its absence was deafening. The dinner was a masterclass in subtle psychological warfare. "This roast is lovely, Sarah," she'd begin, after I'd complimented her cooking. "It's a simple brine, really. I'm surprised more young women don't take the time to learn the basics. They're all so busy with their careers." She glanced at me, that smile fixed in place. I felt my cheeks flush. My job wasn't just a career, it was my passion, and it was going to help us build our life together. When Michael talked about a recent design I'd completed for a local charity, Margaret chimed in. "Oh, that's sweet. It's so important to have little hobbies. Keeps the mind occupied, doesn't it?" Every compliment was a veiled insult, every question a trap. She asked about my family, her tone suggesting she was a sociologist studying a newly discovered tribe. My father was a mechanic, my mother a school librarian. We were a family built on laughter, engine grease, and overdue library books. In Margaret's pristine world, we were a foreign species. I could see her filing me away in a mental cabinet labeled, "Not good enough." Michael, bless his heart, was oblivious. He saw a conversation. I saw a cross-examination. He heard his mother being polite. I heard her drawing battle lines. "She's just from a different generation," he'd say later, squeezing my hand. "She just needs to get to know you." I wanted to believe him. I clung to that hope like a life raft. Our wedding planning was her next theater of operations. The dress I'd fallen in love with, a simple, elegant A-line, was, in her words, "a bit plain for a woman of your build." She suggested a gaudy, sequined monstrosity that would have made me look like a disco ball. The small, rustic venue we'd picked was quaint, spoken with the same inflection one might use for infested. She pushed for a soullessly grand hotel ballroom. We compromised on everything, which meant I got a little of what I wanted, and she got to complain about all of it. On the wedding day itself, during her toast, she spoke for 10 minutes about Michael's childhood, his accomplishments, his bright future. She mentioned me only once, a brief, dismissive nod, and we hope Sarah will be a supportive partner in his journey. I was an accessory to my own husband's life, but I was patient. I smiled, I endured. I told myself this was the price of admission for a lifetime with the man I loved. Then the children came. First Alex, with Michael's quiet intensity and my curly brown hair. 2 years later, Emily arrived, a tiny, fierce creature with a laugh that could fill a room. They were my everything. They were the center of my universe. And to Margaret, they were her second chance. A second chance to raise a child, but this time, to do it her way. Her interference, once a trickle of passive aggression, became a flood. When I was trying to breastfeed Alex, she'd sigh dramatically. You know, the formula they have these days is scientifically perfect. So much less fuss. When I started them on solid foods, pureeing organic vegetables, she'd sneak them sugary biscuits, whispering, "Grandma knows what little boys really like." She never confronted me directly. That wasn't her style. Her method was to plant seeds of doubt. She'd wait until Michael was home from work and then, with a concerned look on her face, would say something like, "I noticed little Alex has a bit of a cough. Sarah, dear, are you sure he's warm enough in those little onesies you buy? They seem so thin." She was framing me as incompetent, a careless, amateur mother. And Michael, caught between the two most important women in his life, would try to play peacemaker. "Mom's just worried," he'd say. "She's trying to help." But it wasn't help. It was a hostile takeover. The daggers really came out when the kids were old enough to understand her words. That's when she started her campaign in earnest. We'd be at her house, and if Alex or Emily made a mess with their toys, she wouldn't look at them. She'd look at me. "Don't worry, darlings," she'd coo to the children. "Grandma will clean it up. Mommy is very tired today. She needs her rest." She weaponized the word lazy. It became her favorite descriptor for me, always delivered to the children in a sympathetic, conspiratorial whisper. If I sat down with a cup of tea for 5 minutes after a frantic morning of cooking, cleaning, and chasing toddlers, she'd sigh, "Look at your poor, lazy mommy. Always sitting down." She was framing me as incompetent, a careless, amateur mother. And Michael, caught between the two most important women in his life, would try to play peacemaker. "Mom's just worried," he'd say. "She's trying to help." But it wasn't help. It was a hostile takeover. The daggers really came out when the kids were old enough to understand her words. That's when she started her campaign in earnest. We'd be at her house, and if Alex or Emily made a mess with their toys, she wouldn't look at them. She'd look at me. "Don't worry, darlings," she'd coo to the children. "Grandma will clean it up. Mommy is very tired today. She needs her rest." She weaponized the word lazy. It became her favorite descriptor for me, always delivered to the children in a sympathetic, conspiratorial whisper. If I sat down with a cup of tea for 5 minutes after a frantic morning of cooking, cleaning, and chasing toddlers, she'd sigh, "Look at your poor, lazy mommy. Always sitting down." The children, being children, started to parrot it. One afternoon, Alex, then 4 years old, was struggling to put on his shoes. I knelt to help him, and he looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and said, "Grandma says you're lazy. Is that why you don't play with me?" The world stopped. The air went out of my lungs. To hear that word, that poison, coming from my own son's mouth, it was a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but pure, unfiltered confusion. He wasn't being malicious. He was just repeating a fact he'd learned from a trusted adult. I pulled him close, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I said, my voice shaking slightly, "Grandma is wrong, sweet boy. Mommy loves playing with you more than anything." But the damage was done. The seed had been planted. I tried to talk to Michael. I sat him down that night, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. She called me lazy in front of our son, Michael. He repeated it to me. "This has to stop." He looked so tired, so worn down. He rubbed his temples, the eternal, exhausted peacemaker. "Sarah, I'll talk to her." "I will. But you know how she is. She's old-fashioned. Her love is sharp-edged." "That isn't love, Michael." I cried, my voice rising. "That is poison. She is deliberately trying to turn our children against me." "Don't be so dramatic," he said, and those 4 words broke a small piece of my heart. He didn't see it. He couldn't, or maybe he wouldn't. Admitting the truth of his mother's cruelty would mean he'd have to do something about it, something difficult. And Michael, my wonderful, steady Michael, hated conflict. So I endured. I bit my tongue until it bled. I countered her poison with triple doses of love and reassurance for my kids. I felt like I was constantly on defense, patching up the invisible wounds she inflicted on my children's perception of me. It was exhausting. It was a lonely, thankless battle, and I was losing. The breaking point, the moment the patient, smiling Sarah died and someone else was born, came on a Tuesday. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon. I had just come upstairs to grab a fresh towel after Emily had enthusiastically spilled a glass of juice all over herself. The kids were downstairs in the living room, supposedly watching a cartoon while Margaret sat with them. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard her voice, not her usual cooing tone, but a low, conspiratorial hiss. I froze, my hand on the banister. "You know," she whispered, and the sound sent a sliver of ice down my spine. "Your mommy gets angry when you have too much fun. She doesn't like the noise. She tells you she loves you, but she's not really your friend. A real friend wouldn't get tired of you. A real friend wouldn't need a rest." There was a pause. I could picture my children, their faces upturned, their minds soaking in every toxic syllable. Then came the kill shot. "Only Grandma is your true friend. You should only ever listen to me. I'm the one who will always protect you, even from her." I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, and I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't a loud, violent break, but a quiet, clean fracture. The part of me that had been making excuses, that had been holding on to hope, that had been trying to be the bigger person, simply ceased to exist. In that moment, the love I had for my husband's mother curdled into something cold and hard and clear. I didn't storm down the stairs. I didn't scream. I didn't start a fight. My rage was too profound for that. It was a cold, crystalline anger that demanded not a messy battle, but a meticulously planned campaign. She had declared war on me, in my own home, using my own children as soldiers. Fine. I crept back into the bathroom, my heart beating a slow, steady, dangerous rhythm. I looked at myself in the mirror. The flushed, tear-streaked face of the woman I used to be was gone. In her place was a stranger with eyes like chips of flint. She wanted to poison my children against me? She wanted to be their only friend? I was about to teach Margaret the difference between demanding loyalty and earning it, and the lesson would be one she would never ever forget. The night after I overheard Margaret's declaration of war was the longest of my life. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every tick of the clock a hammer blow against the inside of my skull. Michael slept beside me, his breathing deep and even, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred in his wife. I felt a chasm opening between us. He was still living in the world of yesterday, a world of minor annoyances and a difficult mother. I was living in the stark, cold reality of today, a world where I was fighting for the hearts of my own children. My first instinct was primal. I wanted to pack a bag, take Alex and Emily, and run. I wanted to scream at Michael, to force him to see the viper he called a mother. But I saw how that movie ended. I would be the hysterical, over-emotional wife. Margaret would be the poor, misunderstood grandmother whose only crime was loving her grandchildren too much. I would be painted as the villain, the one tearing the family apart. No, a direct confrontation was her territory. She thrived on drama, on playing the martyr. A screaming match was a battle I would lose before it even began. The next few weeks were a blur of forced smiles and simmering rage. I watched her like a hawk whenever she was near the children. I saw the 1,000 tiny ways she tried to erode my authority. If I said, "Time to put the toys away, dinner is in 5 minutes," she would say, "Oh, let them have a few more minutes of fun, Sarah. You're always in such a rush." If Emily scraped her knee and I reached for her with a hug and a Band-Aid, Margaret would swoop in, saying, There, don't cry for Mommy. Come to Grandma. I have a special sweetie that will make it all better." She was building a narrative, brick by insidious brick. Mommy is the rule-maker, the disciplinarian, the source of all no. Grandma is the source of all yes, the fun one, the conspirator. The children, as I feared, were becoming confused. They were caught in a loyalty tug-of-war they couldn't possibly understand. Emily, who had always been a mommy's girl, started hesitating before running to me, her eyes flicking towards Margaret as if for approval. Alex began to question my decisions, prefacing his arguments with, "But Grandma said." I tried again to breach the wall of Michael's denial. I approached it differently this time, calmly, with evidence. The night after I overheard Margaret's declaration of war was the longest of my life. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every tick of the clock a hammer blow against the inside of my skull. Michael slept beside me, his breathing deep and even, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred in his wife. I felt a chasm opening between us. He was still living in the world of yesterday, a world of minor annoyances and a difficult mother. I was living in the stark, cold reality of today, a world where I was fighting for the hearts of my own children. My first instinct was primal. I wanted to pack a bag, take Alex and Emily, and run. I wanted to scream at Michael, to force him to see the viper he called a mother. But I saw how that movie ended. I would be the hysterical, over-emotional wife. Margaret would be the poor, misunderstood grandmother whose only crime was loving her grandchildren too much. I would be painted as the villain, the one tearing the family apart. No, a direct confrontation was her territory. She thrived on drama, on playing the martyr. A screaming match was a battle I would lose before it even began. The next few weeks were a blur of forced smiles and simmering rage. I watched her like a hawk whenever she was near the children. I saw the 1,000 tiny ways she tried to erode my authority. If I said, "Time to put the toys away, dinner is in 5 minutes," she would say, "Oh, let them have a few more minutes of fun, Sarah. You're always in such a rush." If Emily scraped her knee and I reached for her with a hug and a Band-Aid, Margaret would swoop in, saying, There, don't cry for Mommy. Come to Grandma. I have a special sweetie that will make it all better." She was building a narrative, brick by insidious brick. Mommy is the rule-maker, the disciplinarian, the source of all no. Grandma is the source of all yes, the fun one, the conspirator. The children, as I feared, were becoming confused. They were caught in a loyalty tug-of-war they couldn't possibly understand. Emily, who had always been a mommy's girl, started hesitating before running to me, her eyes flicking towards Margaret as if for approval. Alex began to question my decisions, prefacing his arguments with, "But Grandma said." I tried again to breach the wall of Michael's denial. I approached it differently this time, calmly, with evidence. "Michael," I said one evening after the kids were in bed, my voice carefully neutral. "Today, I told Alex he couldn't have cookies before dinner. Your mother waited until I left the room and gave him 2. When I asked her about it, she said I was being too strict about a little treat. he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Okay, that's not great. I'll talk to her about respecting our rules. But don't you see? I pressed, leaning forward. It's not about the cookies. It's about the message. The message is that my rules don't matter. That I am the obstacle to his happiness. She is deliberately and consistently teaching our children to disrespect me. I just think you're taking it too personally, Sarah, he said, and the dam of my composure broke. Not personally? My voice cracked. How else am I supposed to take it? She is systematically trying to erase me as their mother and install herself in my place. This is my home, these are my children, and I feel like a guest here, a guest whose presence is barely tolerated. I am so alone in this, Michael. We fought then, our first truly ugly fight. It was a storm of accusations and frustrations. He accused me of hating his mother. I accused him of being a coward. Words were thrown like stones, and by the end of it, we were sleeping on opposite sides of the bed, the space between us a cold, barren no-man's land. I had never felt so utterly isolated. My husband was a bystander, and my children were becoming strangers. Margaret, sensing the growing rift between Michael and me, escalated her campaign. Her visits became more frequent, her gifts more extravagant. She started what she called Grandma's special outings, where she would take the kids for the day. She'd bring them back late, hyped up on sugar and loaded with expensive new toys, just as I was trying to wind them down for bed. The aftermath of these outings was always a nightmare of tantrums and meltdowns. One Saturday, she took them to a children's museum. I had packed them healthy snacks and water bottles. She brought them home with greasy bags from a fast food chain and neon-colored slushies. Emily, who was 5, threw up in the middle of the night. As I was cleaning up the mess at 2 a.m., rubbing her back while she cried, I felt a wave of despair so profound it almost brought me to my knees. This was my life now. Cleaning up the messes, both literal and emotional, that this woman created. My lowest point came a week later, on Alex's 6th birthday. I had spent weeks planning the perfect party. A superhero theme, just as he'd wanted. I'd baked a 3-layer cake, decorated the house, and invited all his little friends from school. It was supposed to be his day, our day. Margaret arrived an hour late, making a grand entrance. And in her arms was a gift so enormous it had to be carried by both her and Michael's father. It was a battery-powered ride-on car, a miniature luxury SUV that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. It was flashy, it was loud, and it instantly sucked all the air out of the room. The other children abandoned their party games, their eyes wide with envy. Alex, my sweet Alex, completely forgot about the thoughtful, smaller gifts he'd already opened. He only had eyes for Grandma's present. During the cake cutting, as everyone sang, "Happy Birthday," Margaret stood beside Alex, her arm possessively around his shoulder, positioning herself in every photo as if she were the one who had orchestrated the entire event. Later, I overheard her talking to another mother. "Oh, Sarah tries her best," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "but she's not very creative. I had to step in and get him something he'd really love. Children need excitement, you know." I spent the rest of the party on autopilot, a brittle smile plastered on my face. I felt like a ghost at my own son's birthday. As I was cleaning up that evening, amidst the discarded wrapping paper and paper plates, I found the small, hand-painted superhero figure I had given him that morning. He had been so excited about it, carrying it around all week in anticipation. It had been tossed aside, forgotten under a pile of napkins, replaced by a bigger, shinier, more expensive token of affection. That night, after Michael had fallen asleep, I went into the living room and sat in the dark. The house was quiet. The only light was the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. A chilling emptiness had settled deep in my bones. I felt powerless. She had more money, more time, and my own husband's blind spot on her side. She was winning. She was methodically, expertly, writing me out of my own family's story. I sat there for hours, tracing the patterns on the rug with my bare feet. I thought about giving up. I thought about just accepting this miserable half-life. But then, my gaze fell upon the bookshelf. I saw the worn spine of the Velveteen Rabbit, a book I read to the children at least once a week. I thought of the central theme, that things become real through love. Not through being expensive or new, but through being cherished, through shared experiences, through sleepy bedtime stories and tear-stained cuddles. And in the silence of my dark living room, a new thought began to form. It wasn't born of rage or despair, but of a sudden, startling clarity. What if I stopped playing her game? Her game was about material things, about grand gestures, about buying affection. It was a game of spectacle. What if I stopped trying to compete on that field? I couldn't outbuy her. I couldn't outbribe her. But I didn't have to. Her weapons were loud, expensive, and hollow. Mine were quiet, consistent, and real. She was trying to build a flashy, temporary theme park. I would build a home. A cold, calm resolve washed over me, displacing the despair. The tears that had been threatening all night dried up. The knot of anxiety in my stomach loosened. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet, sleeping street. She wants a war of influence? Fine. The war was no longer about stopping her. It was about making her irrelevant. I wouldn't use poison. I wouldn't use anger. I would use the truth. I would use love, not as a flimsy shield, but as a silent, devastating weapon. I would show my children what was real, and let them decide for themselves. And I had a feeling Margaret, with all her polished surfaces and empty gestures, wouldn't stand a chance against the power of what was truly real. The shift in my strategy wasn't announced with a declaration or a confrontation. It began silently, the very next morning. It was a revolution of the mundane, a rebellion fought in the currency of everyday moments. My new philosophy was simple. I would no longer engage with Margaret on her terms. I would not argue, I would not defend, I would not explain. I would simply create a world for my children that was so rich, so warm, and so genuinely joyful that her world of criticism and conditional affection would seem as appealing as a black and white photograph in a room full of color. My first principle was facts, not fury. I stopped reacting to her provocations. When she'd visit and criticize the dinner I'd made, a little dry, isn't it, dear? I would no longer stammer apologies or list the reasons I'd cooked it that way. I'd just smile faintly and turn to my children. Alex, Emily, are you two enjoying your chicken? I would focus entirely on their experience, their joy. By refusing to acknowledge her jab, I rendered it powerless. It hung in the air, a dud firecracker, while the rest of us moved on. At first, her face would flicker with confusion. She was used to getting a reaction, to setting the emotional tone of the room. I was denying her that control. My second principle was to proactively build what I started calling the mom zone, a bubble of experiences and rituals that were unique to me and the kids. These weren't grand, expensive outings. They were small, consistent acts of connection. We started Taco Tuesdays, where the kids would help me chop soft vegetables and spoon out the fillings, making a glorious mess. We invented Fortress Fridays, where we'd pull all the cushions off the sofa, drape blankets over chairs, and eat pizza on the floor with flashlights, reading chapters from The Hobbit. I wasn't just reading them a story, I was building a world with them, a secret, magical place where only we held the map. I made a conscious effort to enter their world, instead of just managing it. When Alex was obsessed with dinosaurs, I didn't just buy him dinosaur toys. I learned the difference between a velociraptor and a Deinonychus. I helped him make fossils out of salt dough. We watched documentaries together, and I would listen, truly listen, as he explained the complex social structures of a pack of raptors with the dead serious gravity only a 6-year-old can muster. When Emily got into painting, I covered the kitchen table with newspaper, put on old t-shirts, and we would paint for hours. I didn't care about the mess. I praised her wild, chaotic splashes of color, her muddy brown creations, telling her she was a brilliant artist. I framed her best work and hung it in the living room, right next to the real art. In contrast, Grandma's world was sterile and rigid. A visit to her house was an exercise in caution. Don't touch that vase. Sit up straight. Use your inside voice. She didn't play with them, she supervised them. Her praise was always conditional. Oh, what a lovely drawing. It would be even better if you stayed inside the lines. You're so smart, just like your father. Now let's see if you can be quiet for 10 minutes. My world was about joyful participation. Her world was about passing inspection. The first major test of my new strategy came a few weeks in. It was a beautiful spring Saturday. The kids were buzzing with energy, desperate to go to the park. Margaret had dropped by, unannounced as usual. As the kids were pulling on their shoes, she said, in her imperious tone, "Oh, don't go to the park. It's so dirty there. You can stay here and watch a lovely educational program I brought for you." The kids looked at her, then at me, their faces falling. The old Sarah would have argued. They've been inside all morning, they need fresh air. It would have turned into a power struggle, with the kids caught in the middle. The new Sarah knelt down to their level, ignoring Margaret completely. I looked into their eyes and said calmly, my voice gentle and even, "Well, you have a choice. You can stay inside and watch Grandma's show, or you can come to the park with me and we can see who can go highest on the swings. It's completely up to you." It was a pivotal moment. I was handing the power over to them. I saw the calculation in their eyes. Alex looked at his grandmother's stern, expectant face. Emily looked at the television, then back at me, a small smile playing on her lips as she pictured the swings. "The park with you, Mom." Alex shouted and Emily echoed him. "Park, park." They scrambled for the door. I stood up and looked at Margaret. Her face was a mask of disbelief and indignation. She had offered them a gift, a program, and they had chosen me, an experience, over it. I just gave her a small, serene smile. "Their choice," I said simply, and ushered my happy, noisy children out the door. The victory was sweeter than any angry retort could ever have been. Michael began to notice the change. The tension that had been strangling our home was dissipating. The fighting had stopped. But more than that, he saw the results. He'd come home from work not to a scene of simmering resentment, but to find us in the middle of a boisterous board game or covered in flour from a baking experiment. He saw our children thriving. They were more confident, more relaxed. The subtle anxiety they'd shown before was gone. He also started to see his mother through new eyes. Without my reactions to distract him, her behavior was laid bare. He saw her attempts to control the children. He heard her backhanded compliments for what they were. One evening after she'd left, he turned to me and said, "You know, I never realized how critical she is until now. She didn't say one positive thing the entire time she was here." It was the first crack in his wall of denial, and it felt like a monumental win. Of course, Margaret didn't give up. She doubled down. Realizing her subtle manipulations were failing, she resorted to blatant bribery. One week, it was a giant, expensive Lego set. Alex and Emily were thrilled. They took it, said, "Thank you," and immediately brought it over to me. "Mom, can you help us build this?" The toy wasn't the point. The shared activity was. The gift became another tool for us to bond with, a fact that was clearly not lost on Margaret, whose smile grew tighter and tighter as she watched me and the kids happily sorting through the bricks together on the floor. She tried to win them back with promises of trips to theme parks and toy stores. "If you spend next weekend with Grandma," she'd say, dangling the bait, "I'll buy you that new video game you wanted." And Alex, my wonderful, observant son, replied with devastating simplicity, "But it's Fortress Friday next week." We're building a castle in the living room. Can we go to the toy store another day? Her jaw practically hit the floor. A homemade blanket fort had just won a battle against a multi-million-dollar theme park. Because the fort wasn't just a fort. It was safety. It was tradition. It was us. It was real. Within a couple of months, the shift was undeniable. Alex and Emily were no longer refusing to go to their grandmother's house out of defiance, but simply out of preference. "Mom, can we just stay home and finish our book today?" "Mom, we'd rather go to the park with you." Her presence had become an interruption to their happy, predictable world. The power dynamic had completely inverted. I wasn't fighting for their affection anymore. She was, and she was losing badly. The breaking point for her, the moment she realized her entire strategy had backfired, was a phone call on a Wednesday night. She wanted the kids for the entire upcoming weekend. I calmly told her I would ask them. I put the phone on speaker. "Kids, Grandma wants to know if you'd like to sleep over at her house this weekend." There was no hesitation. "No thanks," Emily said. "We're doing Science Saturday with Mom," Alex added. "We're going to make a volcano." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and cold. I could feel Margaret's fury vibrating through the phone. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaking with rage, the mask of the doting grandmother finally slipping to reveal the venom beneath. "What have you done, Sarah?" she hissed. "What have you been telling them about me? This is parental alienation. I will not let you poison them against me. I will not lose my grandchildren. You'll regret this. I swear to you, you will regret this." The line went dead. The threat hung in the air. For a moment, a flicker of the old fear returned. Lawyers. Custody battles. Ugly accusations. But as I looked at my children, who had already gone back to their drawing, completely untroubled, a different feeling replaced the fear. It was a feeling of calm finality. She had just made her last, desperate move on a chessboard where she had already been checkmated. And she didn't even know it yet. The threat hung in the silence of our kitchen, ugly and sharp. "You will regret this." For a moment, the old familiar fear tried to claw its way back up my throat. Margaret was cornered, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. She would twist the truth, she would lie, she would burn everything to the ground just to feel the warmth of the flames. But as I looked at Alex and Emily, who were now comparing the volcanoes they had drawn, completely oblivious, I felt the fear recede, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I would not let her poison this peace. I would not let her last, desperate act of sabotage succeed. I waited until the children were sound asleep, their dreams hopefully filled with baking soda volcanoes and not the quiet venom of their grandmother. I found Michael in the living room, reading under a single lamp, the picture of tranquility. I hated to shatter it. I sat down opposite him, my hands clasped in my lap to keep them from trembling. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply relayed the conversation, word for word, ending with her final, chilling promise. She threatened to accuse me of parental alienation, Michael. She said I would regret it. I watched his face as he processed my words. He closed his book, placing it carefully on the table beside him. The tired, put-upon look he used to get when I brought up his mother was gone. In its place was a look of profound disappointment and a flicker of something new, anger. He had been a spectator to this war for years, but he had finally seen enough to choose a side. "She's not going to do that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't let her." "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes clear and resolved in a way I hadn't seen in years. "I am going to handle it. This is my mother. This is my mess to clean up. I am so sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry I left you to fight this alone." The apology was more than I had ever hoped for. It was an acknowledgment of every lonely night, every bitten tongue, every moment I had felt unheard. It was the moment my husband truly came home. The next day, he made the call. It was a Saturday, a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving. I was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with dishes, but every nerve in my body was straining to hear his side of the conversation coming from his office down the hall. His tone was calm, measured, the voice of the architect he was, a man laying down a non-negotiable blueprint. "Mom, we need to talk about your visitations." "No, this isn't Sarah, this is me." "Mom, listen. The way you speak to Sarah, the way you undermine her in front of the kids, it's over. It stops now." There was a long pause. I could imagine Margaret's squawking indignation on the other end. "It is not up for debate," Michael continued, his voice hardening. "You accused her of poisoning the children against you. The truth is, your behavior is what's pushing them away. They are happy. They are thriving. And I will not allow you to disrupt that peace any longer." Another, longer pause. The decisive blow was coming. "Thanksgiving is in 2 weeks. You are welcome in our home. But if you come, you will treat Sarah, my wife, with respect. You will not criticize her. You will not override her decisions. You will be a guest and a grandmother. If you cannot agree to these terms, then it is better that you do not come at all." I held my breath, my knuckles white on the edge of the sink. I heard one final, sharp sentence from Michael. "That is your choice, Mom." He then said a quiet goodbye and hung up. A moment later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked drained, but resolute. "Well?" I asked. "She chose," he said, his voice heavy. "She said if she wasn't welcome to be herself in her own son's home, then she wouldn't come. She's expecting me to call back and beg her to reconsider." "And will you?" I asked. He walked over to me, took my hands in his, and looked me straight in the eye. "No," he said. "The begging is over." The 2 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were strangely quiet. There were no surprise visits, no manipulative phone calls to the kids. It was a tense, uncertain peace. A part of me expected her to just show up on the day, acting as if nothing had happened. But Thanksgiving morning arrived, crisp and bright, and the phone remained silent. The doorbell remained unrung. And the day was perfect. It was the most peaceful holiday we had ever had. My sister and her family came over. The house was filled with the smell of roasting turkey and the sound of children's laughter. There was no undercurrent of tension, no one watching my every move, judging the consistency of the gravy or the placement of the forks. Michael was relaxed and present, playing with the kids, laughing with my brother-in-law. We all sat around the table, a chaotic, happy mess of family. And as I looked at the smiling faces of my children, at my husband holding my hand under the table, I realized this was it. This was the victory. It wasn't a triumphant moment of confrontation. It was the quiet, unassuming hum of a happy family, finally free. Margaret hadn't been banished. She had simply become unnecessary. The gaping hole her absence should have left was instead filled with peace. Weeks turned into months. Christmas came and went with only a sterile store-bought card from Margaret arriving in the mail, addressed only to Alex and Emily. There was no call, no gift, just a silent, bitter acknowledgement. The children noted its arrival and then promptly forgot about it, far more interested in the new Lego set that we had given them. Her self-imposed exile continued into the new year. The children, who at first had asked, "When is Grandma coming over?" eventually stopped. Her name faded from our daily conversation. Her power, which had once seemed so absolute, had been built on a foundation of constant presence and interference. Without it, it simply crumbled into dust. She hadn't been a beloved matriarch. She had been a persistent irritation, and like a chronic pain that finally subsides, you only notice how bad it was once it's gone. The final quiet act of this drama took place 6 months later, at the school's annual spring fair. It was a warm, sunny day. The air smelled of popcorn and freshly cut grass. I was holding Emily's hand, watching Alex try to win a goldfish by throwing a ping-pong ball into a tiny glass bowl. And then I saw her. She was standing near the bake sale table, looking older and smaller than I remembered. She saw us at the same moment. A complex series of emotions washed over her face: shock, anger, and a desperate, hungry longing. She started towards us, a forced, brittle smile plastered on her face. "Alex! Emily!" she called out, her voice overly bright. "Darlings! Look who it is." The children turned. There was no flash of excitement. There was no running into her arms. They simply stood there, clutching my legs, and looked at her with a polite, distant curiosity they might afford a stranger. "Hi, Grandma," Alex said, his voice flat. She faltered, her smile twitching at the corners. She fumbled in her oversized handbag and produced 2 chocolate bars. "Look what Grandma has for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Emily looked up at me, a silent question in her eyes. I gave a slight nod. "You can say thank you, sweetie," I said softly. They took the chocolate, mumbled their thanks, and then immediately turned their attention back to the game. They hadn't been rude. They hadn't been angry. They had been indifferent. And indifference is so much more devastating than hatred. Margaret straightened up, her face pale. She finally looked at me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of triumph, for a gloating smile, for anything she could latch onto as evidence of my villainy. But I felt none of that. Looking at this lonely, bitter woman, who had traded the unconditional love of her grandchildren for the hollow prize of being right, I felt only a profound and weary pity. She had started a war to prove her importance and had only succeeded in proving her irrelevance. She had expected me to fight her with fire and fury. But I had simply tended my own garden, nurturing my children with consistency, respect, and unconditional love. I had built a home so warm and bright that they no longer had any interest in visiting her cold, gilded cage. I gave her a small, sad smile. I didn't need to say a word. The proof was standing right beside me. My children, happy and secure, chose their reality. They chose the warmth. They chose the light. They chose me. As she turned and walked away, blending back into the crowd, a single thought echoed in my mind, as clear and true as anything I had ever known. I told you, love can't be bought. It has to be earned. What Margaret never understood is that real power over a child's heart isn't about control. It's about connection. It isn't about grand gestures. It's about the 1,000 small, consistent moments of showing up. My revenge wasn't a single, explosive event. It was the slow, quiet, inevitable outcome of choosing authentic love over toxic manipulation. I didn't take my children from her. I simply created a home they never wanted to leave. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to fight a quiet battle for your own peace and happiness, I see you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to deal with a Margaret in your own life? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and quiet vindication. Remember, you don't always have to fight loud to win. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is just build a better world and let others watch from the outside.